A single teacup, a shattered secret, and a murder no one saw coming. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mythren. This community is amazing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your words make this mystery even more thrilling. Now, let's begin. It was an unusually warm evening in St. Mildred's, the kind of golden dusk that painted the cottage windows in honey and set the air abuzz with the lazy hum of summer. The village had been its usual tranquil self until the arrival of the midnight tea room. The tea room was a novelty, opened only 2 months prior by a certain Mrs. Clarissa Pennington, a widow of uncertain age with an even more uncertain past. Every Friday, she hosted her famed midnight tea, a gathering of villagers too curious or restless to sleep. The concept was deliciously scandalous. Tea and scones at midnight. Laughter, whispers, and a pianist playing softly in the corner. This Friday, however, would be different. At precisely 11:30, the guests began to arrive. The garden lamps flickered under a soft mist, casting a hazy glow over the rose bushes and trellises. Inside, the tea room glimmered with polished silver, gleaming porcelain, and the faint scent of bergamot. There was Reverend Samuel Blythe, genial but pompous, whose sermons were often longer than his prayers. His wife, Mrs. Blythe, came too, though it was well known she disapproved of late-night frivolity. Then there was young Harold Finch, the new bank clerk with a curious air of nervous ambition, and Miss Lydia Wren, the schoolmistress whose prim exterior barely concealed her sharp tongue. Lastly, there was Mr. Edward Tolland, a gentleman recently returned from the colonies, whose easy charm made him the object of much speculation and no small amount of envy among the local men. Mrs. Pennington herself greeted each guest with her signature smile, that faintly amused, faintly secretive smile that made one wonder just how much she knew about everyone else. At 5 minutes to midnight, just as the first pot of tea was poured, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Pennington's maid, a timid girl named Elsie, answered. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark coat, travel-stained and weary. His voice was quiet, but his eyes held an unsettling sharpness. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said. "I'm looking for Mrs. Pennington. We've met before, long ago." The room fell silent. Clarissa Pennington's teacup trembled faintly as she rose. "Indeed," she said, her tone light but her complexion pale. "I can't imagine." But she stopped mid-sentence. The man had taken off his hat. Something in his face, or perhaps in her memory, froze her completely. "Of course," she murmured faintly. "You'd better come in." The newcomer was introduced only as Mr. Graham, though he offered no further details. Conversation, once lively, now limped along with forced pleasantries. The pianist fumbled a note. Reverend Blythe coughed into his napkin. Miss Wren stared with barely concealed curiosity. At midnight, the grandfather clock chimed. 12 clear tones filled the room, and then came the scream. It was Elsie, the maid. She stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her face white as linen. "Mrs. Pennington," she cried. "Oh, ma'am, she's—" The teapot slipped from Lydia Wren's hand, shattering on the floor. Clarissa Pennington was lying motionless near the sideboard, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, one hand still clutching her teacup. The midnight tea had become a midnight death. 2 streets away, in her quiet cottage, lined with lace curtains and rose-embroidered cushions, Miss Jane Marple was just putting away her knitting. She had no intention of attending Mrs. Pennington's peculiar event. "Of course, late-night tea," she had said. "Sounds a most improper hour for gossip." But when the church bell tolled thrice after midnight, a signal from Reverend Blythe's boy sent running through the lanes, Miss Marple fetched her shawl and stepped out into the night. For if there was one thing Jane Marple knew, it was that in every quiet village, beneath every pleasant smile, there was always something waiting to be uncovered. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, The Village Reacts, where gossip, suspicion, and secrets begin to ripple through St. Mildred's? The news of Mrs. Pennington's death spread through St. Mildred's like the ripple of a stone dropped into a still pond, quiet at first, then widening, unstoppable. By morning, the entire village was alive with murmurs. The grocer's wife claimed she'd heard the scream herself from 2 streets away. The vicar's gardener swore the mysterious stranger had been lurking near the churchyard the day before. Everyone had a version of events, though few had seen anything at all. The police arrived from the nearby town of Market Brougham before dawn, a trio of practical men in dark coats. They found Mrs. Pennington still lying near the sideboard, her teacup shattered beside her, and a faint bruise already forming along her neck. The coroner muttered about asphyxiation, possibly sudden, but the constable's eye fell upon the spilled tea. Poison, more likely, he said gravely, and that became the story before the day was done. Miss Marple, summoned by the anxious Mrs. Blythe, arrived soon after. She stood in the doorway, small and neat, her expression one of mild concern. The policeman, recognizing her from other village affairs, gave her a polite nod, but no more. They knew her reputation, though they preferred to handle matters by the book. Still, they did not stop her when she began quietly asking the servants questions in her soft, grandmotherly voice. Elsie, the maid, trembled as she spoke. "She was well, ma'am. Just a little nervous after the gentleman came. She asked for her special blend, the one she keeps separate. I fetched it myself from the tin-marked Darjeeling. Then she poured for everyone, but, oh dear, it was only her cup she drank from before she fell." Miss Marple inclined her head, her blue eyes thoughtful. "Only her own cup, you say? That was rather unusual for Mrs. Pennington, I should think. Yes, ma'am. She always liked others to taste first. Said it was part of the ceremony." The little observation lodged itself quietly in Miss Marple's mind. People rarely changed habits without reason, and Clarissa Pennington, by all accounts, was a woman of routine. As the police took statements, the remaining guests huddled in the drawing-room, subdued yet visibly eager to discuss the matter among themselves. The Reverend Blythe spoke first, his voice heavy with moral gravity. "It is a warning to us all against indulgence in unseemly amusements. Midnight tea. I told my wife as much when the invitation came." Mrs. Blythe sniffed approvingly, but glanced sidelong at Miss Wren, who sat primly with her gloved hands clasped tight. "I thought her charming," Miss Wren said crisply. "A woman of taste. Though I dare say she had a rather unfortunate past. Someone mentioned, was it Monte Carlo?" Edward Tolland, lounging in an armchair, raised an eyebrow. "A fine lady, Mrs. Pennington. Too fine for this village, perhaps. And if she had a past, well, most of us do, Miss Wren." Harold Finch gave a nervous little laugh. "You don't mean to suggest anything improper, Mr. Tolland?" "I mean," Tolland replied smoothly, "that the lady seemed to have known people one doesn't meet every day in St. Mildred's. That gentleman last night, for instance. Mr. Graham, was it? She recognized him, I'll wager, and not pleasantly." The room fell silent. Each person turned the name over in their minds like a new coin. Mr. Graham, the stranger. Where was he now? The constable had already made inquiries. The man had vanished before the doctor arrived, gone into the night, leaving only his empty teacup behind. "Said he needed air," Elsie whispered tearfully. "But he never came back." Outside, the morning sun filtered through the rose vines, making the scene seem almost peaceful. Yet there was tension in the air, a subtle unease that made the ordinary sounds of the village sharper. The milk cart rattling down the lane, the bark of a distant dog, each felt charged with meaning. Miss Marple lingered by the sideboard after the others had gone. She examined the scattered fragments of porcelain, the tea stain spreading like a pale brown flower across the carpet. Her gaze drifted to the tin of tea leaves left open on the table. She lifted the lid delicately, inhaling. Then she closed it again, murmuring softly, "Darjeeling indeed." That afternoon the police inspector, a broad, competent man named Craddock, came to call on Miss Marple. He had dealt with her before, and had learned not to underestimate the gentle gleam in her eyes. "Curious business, this," he said, accepting a cup of her tea. Widow living alone, new to the village. Few friends, no family. But quite the social hostess, eh? She liked to observe, I think, Miss Marple replied. People who have lived a little often do. They find village life an excellent stage for the small dramas of human behaviour. Craddock chuckled. Aye, and plenty of players too. We'll need to find this, Mr. Graham. Looks like our best lead. Yes, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Though sometimes, Inspector, the person who disappears isn't the one most in need of finding. Craddock frowned. Meaning? Only that people often run not because they're guilty, she said gently, but because they're frightened. And fear, you know, takes many forms. That evening, Miss Marple walked to the tea-room again, ostensibly to offer help to poor Elsie, who was nearly beside herself. The room had been tidied, though faint traces of the tragedy lingered. The scent of spilt tea, the darkened patch on the carpet. Miss Wren appeared at the doorway, hat in hand. I thought I might collect my handbag, she said. I left it on the piano. Of course, my dear, Miss Marple replied. You mustn't distress yourself more than necessary. As Miss Wren moved through the room, Miss Marple's eyes followed her. There was something odd about the woman's composure, too deliberate, too self-controlled. When the handbag was retrieved, Miss Wren hesitated by the window. You know, she said quietly, Mrs. Pennington wasn't popular with everyone. She had a way of finding things out. Private things. People don't like that in a small village. Miss Marple nodded. No, they don't. Though sometimes, my dear, it's the one who fears being discovered who shouts the loudest against curiosity. Miss Wren's lips pressed together. You mean Harold Finch, perhaps? He's been terribly anxious since last night. I saw him this morning, pacing outside the bank before it opened. When Miss Marple returned home, the lamplight was already softening into dusk. She set her knitting aside and took a small notebook from her drawer. In neat handwriting she listed the names. Clarissa Pennington, deceased. Mr. Graham, stranger. Reverend Blythe. Mrs. Blythe. Harold Finch, Lydia Wren, Edward Tolland. Next to each, she wrote a single word or two. Fear, vanity, ambition, resentment, jealousy, curiosity, guilt. At the end of the line she added another word. T. Then she underlined it twice. By nightfall, the village innkeeper reported that a man answering Graham's description had taken a room 3 nights earlier under the name George Allen. His luggage was still there, unclaimed. Inside one case, the police found only a few shirts, a razor, and a folded photograph. A much younger Mrs. Pennington, smiling beside a man in a military uniform. When Inspector Craddock showed the photograph to Miss Marple, she examined it for a long moment. Ah, she said softly, so that's how it is. Craddock looked puzzled. You knew her before? No, indeed. But human nature doesn't change, Inspector. Not in war, nor peace, nor tea parties at midnight. As the second day drew to a close, the pieces began ever so faintly to align in her mind. A woman afraid, a stranger from her past, a cup poured only for herself. And that curious change in tea leaves, the sort of detail no one else would think important, but which spoke volumes to someone who had spent a lifetime noticing what others overlooked. Outside, the church bell tolled for evening service. Inside, Miss Marple's kettle began to whistle, and she rose slowly to pour the water. People do such foolish things, she murmured to herself, when they think no one is watching. She looked out the window toward the distant lights of the tea-room, and the faintest smile touched her lips, not of triumph but of understanding. The first thread of the truth had been found, though it would take more than 1 cup of tea to unravel the rest. Morning came with a restless hush over St. Mildred's, a hush that made even the sparrow's chatter sound restrained, as though the village itself were holding its breath. In the bakery queue, in the grocer's doorway and by the post-office rail, people leaned closer than usual, their whispers carrying through the crisp air like the rustle of dry leaves. A widow poisoned in her own tea, they murmured. A stranger from nowhere. And Miss Marple about again. It had been years since the village last felt this alive with speculation, and no one could quite resist adding their own embroidery to the tale. Miss Marple had no time for gossip, though she noted it all the same. Each word, each inflection was a clue of its own sort. People revealed far more in rumour than in confession. That morning she walked the short distance to the vicarage, where Reverend Blythe had agreed to meet Inspector Craddock. He had summoned her, too, in a tone that suggested he both valued and feared her counsel. Craddock was already there, bent over a small table with the coroner's preliminary report. "Poison as suspected," he said when Miss Marple entered. "Traces of cyanide in the cup and residue in the pot. The tea tin was clean, fresh leaves. Means it was added after brewing." Miss Marple removed her gloves and folded them neatly on her lap. "Cyanide," she repeated softly. "A dreadful choice. Instant, yes, but unmistakable. Whoever used it wished the cause to be known." The inspector frowned. "That's not how murderers usually think." "Oh, but some do," she said mildly. "When what they wish is not merely to kill, but to expose, or to frighten, to make a statement of some sort." She looked at the vicar, whose ruddy face showed discomfort at the word. "You see, Inspector, I believe Mrs. Pennington was afraid long before she died. She broke her habits, poured her own tea, and looked quite ill at ease once the stranger arrived. Fear changes patterns, but fear of what?" Craddock nodded. "We'll need to know who that man really was. We've sent word to London to trace the name George Allen. If he's military, we might find a record." The vicar cleared his throat. "I dislike speaking ill of the dead, but Mrs. Pennington was secretive, too self-possessed, if you take my meaning. My wife says she kept letters locked in her desk, foreign stamps sometimes." "Locked letters," Miss Marple repeated. "And yet a public tea party every week. Such contrasts tell their own story." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I wonder, Inspector, might I call upon Miss Wren this afternoon? She seems a young woman accustomed to order. People of that kind notice details others miss." Craddock gave a small smile. "You mean she gossips thoroughly?" "Observation, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, "is only gossip with the judgment left in." By afternoon the village had settled into its peculiar rhythm of mourning and curiosity. The tea-room remained closed, its blinds drawn, but already someone had placed a bouquet of lilies by the door. Miss Marple paused there on her walk, noticing the faint trace of boot prints in the soft earth near the gate. Large, square impressions, fresh despite the morning dew. She made a mental note before continuing to the schoolhouse. Lydia Wren received her in the small parlour adjoining her classroom, where the smell of chalk lingered faintly in the air. The young woman's manner was composed yet strained, as though she were determined not to let the village's excitement disturb her sense of propriety. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," she said at once, pouring tea. "I hardly slept. They say Mrs. Pennington was poisoned, but surely that can't be right." "It seems so. Deliberate." "It does indeed," Miss Marple agreed, taking her cup. "You were quite observant at the gathering, I think. Did you notice anything unusual once Mr. Graham arrived?" Miss Wren hesitated. "Only that Mrs. Pennington turned pale. She dropped her napkin at one point, and I thought she might faint. But then she laughed, it was almost forced, and called for the music to begin. As for the gentleman, he seemed perfectly calm. He watched her more than anyone else, I suppose." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "People who have shared a secret often do look at each other that way." "And did you notice anyone else's reaction?" "Harold Finch looked quite unsettled, though that may have been the heat. He drinks too much coffee, poor man. And Mr. Tolland, well, he never looks unsettled, does he? Too sure of himself. I thought he rather enjoyed the drama." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple, "the sort of man who sees tragedy as an entertainment. Such people are useful to observe. They often notice everything, but feel nothing." When Miss Marple left the schoolhouse, she walked slowly, her mind piecing together the subtle pattern of human connections. Clarissa Pennington, had been at the centre of many lives, though she'd only lived in the village a short while. The Reverend's moral indignation, Miss Wren's curiosity, Harold Finch's nervousness, Tolland's vanity. Each motive was distinct, yet somehow entangled. She could feel the shape of a design beneath the surface, like the faint outline of embroidery through muslin. She turned toward the bank where Harold Finch worked. He was alone behind the counter, his hair mussed, his collar askew. When he saw Miss Marple, he started slightly. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm afraid we're just closing." "I won't keep you long," she said kindly. "I only wondered how you are managing after last night's shock." He blinked rapidly. "Oh, quite all right, thank you. Terrible business, of course. I can't imagine who would do such a thing." His hands fiddled with the ledger in front of him. "Mrs. Pennington was a customer of yours, wasn't she?" "Only briefly. She transferred some money when she moved here." "Routine business. And Mr. Tolland?" Finch hesitated. "He has an account as well, yes. I can't discuss details, naturally." "Of course," Miss Marple said with a small nod. "It's only that one sometimes wonders if financial matters create tensions. People misunderstand, promises are made or broken. I recall a case once where an innocent little overdraft led to quite unnecessary tragedy." His face drained of colour. "You think someone killed her for money?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people often kill for reasons far less practical." She thanked him and turned to go, leaving him staring after her, pale and sweating. Outside, she met Inspector Craddock again, striding down the lane. "We've traced your Mr. Graham," he said. "Real name's Major Henry Graham, retired officer. Served in India, discharged with honours. And here's the interesting part. He was once engaged to Mrs. Pennington before she married her late husband." "Engaged," Miss Marple murmured. "How very telling. And he left suddenly after the war, no doubt under unhappy circumstances." "Seems so. He turned up in London last month asking after her. No fixed address, some debts. I suppose she wanted to keep him away." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though she invited him in, you recall. Fear and guilt often arrive together." They walked in silence for a while, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Then Miss Marple asked quietly, "Tell me, Inspector, was there any trace of cyanide in the other cups?" "None, only hers." "Then whoever prepared it must have known exactly where it would end up. Either they served her directly, or she trusted them enough to pour for herself. That's a puzzle, isn't it?" She brewed the tea herself. No one else touched the pot except the maid. Miss Marple stopped walking, except perhaps the person who refilled the sugar bowl. "Did you think to test that?" Craddock looked startled. "The sugar?" "People forget sugar kills more often than bitterness," she said softly. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the lane, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting. Her needles clicked steadily while her thoughts moved faster than her hands. She could see the pattern now. The stranger's sudden arrival, the host's terror, the tea brewed in haste. Someone had waited for that moment. Someone who knew Mrs. Pennington's habits, her pride, her fear of scandal. Across the way, lights flickered in the Tolland house. Edward Tolland was entertaining again, she noticed, though it was barely a day since the murder. She saw his silhouette through the curtain, head thrown back in laughter. A man who found excitement in danger. And perhaps, she thought, a man who preferred others to drink first. The next morning, word reached the village that the laboratory tests confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The sugar was tainted, not the tea. The inspector was astonished. "How could you possibly have known?" he asked when he called on her. "My dear Inspector," she said, pouring him a fresh cup, "because Mrs. Pennington was too careful to trust anyone else's brewing. But she could never resist a sweet cup of tea, and that, you see, was her undoing." Craddock set down his saucer with a sigh. "Then we're looking for someone who handled the sugar bowl before the tea was made. That means either the maid or one of the guests who came early. Or," Miss Marple added, "someone who had reason to visit that afternoon, when the table was set." Her gaze drifted past him to the window, where the morning sun glinted faintly off the tea-room's shuttered sign. She knew in her quiet way that the next step would not be in evidence or testimony but in character. Human nature, as she often said, was a book that never changed. Only the names on the cover did. And now, she felt, she was very close to reading this one's final page. Inspector Craddock left Miss Marple's cottage with the determined stride of a man who had been handed a riddle and refused to admit he was intrigued by it. The revelation about the sugar had shifted the ground beneath his investigation. Poison in the sugar bowl. It was cunning, intimate, and deliberate. Only someone who had known Mrs. Pennington's meticulous ways could have relied upon her reaching for it herself. It was not a random act, but a calculated one, rooted in familiarity. Miss Marple watched him go from her window, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. Then she turned back to her tea tray and studied the sugar bowl before her, as though it might speak if given time. "People are such creatures of habit," she murmured. "They trust what they touch every day, and never think it might turn against them." By mid-morning the village was once again alive with whispers. Elsie, the maid, had been taken in for questioning. Many thought it cruel. A timid girl like that, they said, but others nodded knowingly. Servants always knew too much. Miss Marple knew the police would find little. Elsie might be simple, but she was not deceitful. Her terror was genuine. Poisoning was not her kind of courage. Still, it was best to see for herself. She walked to the small constable's office near the green, her step brisk despite the cane she carried for uneven paths. Elsie sat on a bench, hands twisting in her lap, eyes red from crying. Miss Marple's gentle presence eased her instantly. "Oh, Miss Marple, they think I did it," she sobbed. "But I swear I didn't touch anything after setting the table. Mrs. Pennington herself told me to leave everything ready that afternoon. Teacups, sugar, all neat. I dusted around, but I never lifted the lid." "Of course you didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "You're not the sort to meddle with arrangements once they're made. But tell me, dear, was anyone else about when you were preparing the room?" Elsie blinked, thinking hard. "Mr. Tolland came by, ma'am. He said he'd left his walking stick from the last tea night and asked to fetch it. I let him in while I was polishing the silver. He went into the parlour for just a minute." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile never wavered. "And this was before the tea? In daylight?" "Yes, ma'am, just before supper." He seemed in a hurry, but he was polite as ever. "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. "Men who are charming in a hurry are rather dangerous, I've always found." She patted the girl's hand and rose. "You mustn't worry, my dear. Truth has a way of finding its voice, even when no one listens at first." Outside the air was thick with the scent of rain. Clouds gathered low, pressing down on the thatched roofs. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter and made her way toward the high street. Her next visit was to Edward Tolland's house, a tall Georgian affair on the corner, far grander than his modest income should have afforded. He received her with an easy smile and an exaggerated bow. "My dear Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Do come in out of the gloom. A cup of sherry to warm you?" She declined politely and accepted a seat by the fire. "Such a sad business, Mr. Tolland. You were quite close to Mrs. Pennington, I think." Tolland's expression softened. "A fine lady and much misunderstood. I admired her, certainly, but only as any civilized man would admire a woman of distinction. Distinction, yes. She had that quality. And secrets, too, I suspect. I've heard she kept some rather interesting correspondence locked away." He gave a light laugh. "Every woman keeps something locked away, Miss Marple. It's what makes them fascinating." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "And you, Mr. Tolland? Did you ever have cause to visit her during the day when her staff might be busy?" He leaned back, feigning surprise. "Visit her? Certainly not. One must preserve decorum in a village like ours, though I may have stopped by once to deliver a letter. Nothing scandalous, I assure you." "Oh, I'm sure of it," she said pleasantly. "Only one never knows when such innocent errands may be recalled. For instance, I hear you dropped by the tea room yesterday afternoon." The smile faltered for just a heartbeat. "Ah, yes, yes. I'd misplaced my walking stick. A trivial matter. Elsie was kind enough to let me in." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands in her lap. "And you found the stick, I presume?" "Eventually, yes. I'm glad to hear it. Losing things is so unsettling, don't you think? Though I sometimes wonder if what we call losing is really just forgetting where we put the truth." His gaze sharpened slightly, but she met it with her usual mild serenity. After a moment he laughed again, too lightly. "You're quite the philosopher, Miss Marple. I hope the police aren't troubling that poor maid any longer. It's absurd to think she could have poisoned anyone." "Oh, I quite agree," she said. "But then poisoners are seldom the people we expect. They are neat, calm, and very tidy in their thinking. I imagine you would appreciate that." When she left, the rain had begun to fall in a fine mist. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind weaving threads together. Tolland's charm was practiced, his composure too deliberate, a man accustomed to deceit but confident in his mask. Yet, as she knew well, even the most polished veneer cracks under the smallest pressure. That evening Inspector Craddock called again, his coat damp, his face grim. "We found something, Miss Marple. In Mrs. Pennington's desk, a bundle of letters from Major Graham, old ones. They were engaged once, as we knew, but it seems she broke it off under, let's say, unpleasant circumstances. There's mention of money, a quarrel, and a promise of revenge." "Revenge, yes," she said softly, "but revenge often arrives in disguise. Did you find any letters more recent?" "Only one unsigned, dated a week ago. Says, 'You cannot run from the past forever. I will call on you soon.' Looks bad for the Major, doesn't it?" "Perhaps too bad," she murmured. "Real threats rarely arrive by post. People who mean harm prefer to smile first." The inspector hesitated. "You think someone forged it?" "I think," she replied, "someone wanted Mrs. Pennington frightened enough to act strangely, to pour her own tea, perhaps, to forget herself in the face of danger." He exhaled slowly. "You believe the killer used her fear to set the stage?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. Fear makes people predictable, and predictability makes them easy to kill." The next morning brought news that Major Graham had been found. He was discovered wandering near the railway station, disoriented, half-starved, claiming he'd been robbed on the road. When questioned, he swore he never reached the tea room that night, that he turned back after seeing the lights through the window and realizing she wanted nothing to do with him. Miss Marple visited him briefly, escorted by the inspector. The man looked weary, his face lined and weathered, his manner that of a soldier long out of battle but never out of guilt. "I didn't kill her," he said at once. "I came to make peace, nothing more. But when I saw the laughter inside, I knew she'd forgotten me. I couldn't bear to face her like that." Miss Marple studied him in silence. "And you left her photograph behind in your case," she said gently. "A memento of something unfinished." He lowered his head. "Yes, I thought perhaps she'd still remember that day. India, 1919. The garden at Simla." Her eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "You mustn't reproach yourself, Major. Whatever tragedy befell her, I don't believe it followed you." As they left the station, Craddock spoke quietly. "If he's innocent, we're running out of suspects." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "we're only just beginning to see them clearly. There are lies of guilt, and there are lies of protection. One must tell them apart." That evening she returned to the tea room once more. The shutters were still drawn, the air heavy with the memory of death. She entered softly, as if not to disturb it. On the table the sugar bowl sat where it had been left for evidence, its polished lid reflecting the candlelight. She leaned closer, noting the faintest trace of a fingerprint on the underside, smudged but distinct. It was a small thing, easily missed, but in Miss Marple's world, small things carried weight. She smiled faintly to herself. "Ah," she whispered, "so it was vanity after all." Outside, the clock of St. Mildred's struck 9, the sound echoing through the damp air. The pieces were falling into place now, not yet aligned but close enough to glimpse their pattern. Someone had gone to great lengths to direct suspicion toward the stranger, but the truth she knew was much closer to home, and as she stepped into the cool night, she found herself thinking not of poison or revenge, but of sugar, sweetness masking bitterness, the oldest deception in the world. The following morning dawned pale and cold, the rain having washed the dust from the cobblestones and left the village smelling faintly of wet lilac and smoke. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her mind already turning over the details that had quietly taken shape through the night. She had slept little, but she never minded that. There were times when wakefulness, properly used, could reveal more than sleep ever could. She set her teapot on the stove, measured the leaves with habitual care, and allowed herself the faintest smile. The pieces were aligning now, slowly, delicately, but the picture was not yet whole. There was still one thread that refused to lie flat. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, Miss Marple was sitting in her garden among the late roses, pruning them with serene precision. He looked weary and irritable, as men do when the facts refuse to behave. "We've examined the sugar bowl again," he began without preamble. "There were fingerprints on the lid, as you said. Partial, but enough to tell they're not the maid's. They belong to Edward Tolland." Miss Marple did not look surprised. "Yes, I thought as much." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Then you think he did it?" "The motive fits well enough. Mrs. Pennington was wealthy, and there's reason to believe he was in some sort of financial trouble. Perhaps she refused to lend him money." Miss Marple laid down her shears and folded her hands in her lap. "A reasonable theory, Inspector. And yet I wonder, if Mr. Tolland had truly been desperate, would he not have made a more permanent arrangement for himself? He is far too proud to stoop to begging, and far too indolent to commit so bold a crime without embellishment. No, his vanity is of a different sort. It needs admiration more than security." Craddock frowned. "So you think he tampered with the sugar for some other reason?" "I think he touched the sugar bowl," Miss Marple replied, "because he wished to appear helpful. He's the kind of man who would straighten a vase or rearrange a spoon simply to look attentive. And that, you see, can be rather unfortunate when a crime has already been committed." The inspector sighed. "Then we're back to guessing." "Not guessing, Inspector, observing." She rose gracefully, dusting her hands. "I believe the next step is to visit Mrs. Blythe. Women like her often know more than they realize, though they rarely see it as knowledge. Gossip, after all, is just intuition in its Sunday clothes." Craddock followed her to the vicarage reluctantly, though he had learned by now that resistance was usually useless. Mrs. Blythe received them in her sitting room, where the smell of lavender polish clung to the furniture. She looked as though she had been waiting all morning for exactly this opportunity. "Oh, Miss Marple, such dreadful goings-on," she began. "I keep saying to Samuel that the village will never be the same again. To imagine poison in our midst, and such a refined lady too, though, of course, there were whispers." "Whispers?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Blythe leaned forward, lowering her voice. "About her past, naturally. Some said she was mixed up in some colonial scandal. Others claimed she'd been blackmailed, though I can't imagine what for. But it was Lydia Wren who told me the most interesting thing. Apparently Mrs. Pennington was receiving small parcels by post these past few weeks, always from London. She never said what was in them." "Did anyone see one of these parcels?" Craddock asked. Mrs. Blythe shook her head. "Only Elsie, I believe. She said they were wrapped plainly in brown paper." "Oh, and Lydia mentioned something about an odd smell once. Almonds, she said." Craddock stiffened slightly. "Almonds?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "The characteristic odor of cyanide, Inspector. Though, of course, that doesn't mean the poison came by post. Still, how curious that Miss Wren noticed the scent. She does have a keen nose for trouble." When they left the vicarage, the inspector looked troubled. If those parcels contained poison, then whoever sent them could be the killer. But who would dare post something like that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, one mustn't think of daring, Inspector. One must think of convenience." People often prefer the coward's method. Poison from a distance, letters unsigned, parcels unremarked. But it seems to me the true story lies not in the parcels, but in who knew about them. Lydia Wren, for instance, appears to know rather a lot. She asked Craddock to accompany her to the schoolhouse once more. Miss Wren received them coolly, clearly aware that the tide of suspicion was beginning to shift. "I've told you all I know," she said, her chin lifted. "Mrs. Pennington was kind to me, and I won't have her memory dragged about like gossip." "Quite right," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Only, you see, we must untangle these dreadful rumours to protect her reputation. I believe you mentioned before that she had received parcels. You said they smelled faintly of almonds." Lydia hesitated. "I may have said so. She once opened one while I was there. There was powder inside, white fine. She claimed it was face powder from Paris, but it had a strange sharp smell, and indeed." "And did she ever use it?" "No, I don't think so. She laughed when I asked about it. Said it wasn't for her after all and put it away in her cabinet." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And tell me, Miss Wren, did she ever show you any of her old letters?" "Only once," Lydia replied after a moment. "A letter from her late husband. She said she missed him terribly, and that he had left her well provided for. But she seemed sad that others envied her comfort." "Envy," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, that's a dangerous thing. It turns admiration into something sharper. When they left, Craddock muttered, 'She's hiding something, that one.'" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but not what you think. She's hiding her pride. Miss Wren is a woman who feels overlooked, unappreciated even in kindness. Women like that can be dangerous when placed near something they covet." That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat again by her window, her knitting untouched in her lap. The facts had begun to settle into order. There was the sugar bowl, tampered with before the tea. There was the parcel with its telltale scent. And there was Lydia Wren, who noticed far too much for an innocent bystander. She rose and went to her writing desk, taking out the small notebook she always kept for such matters. Her list now read differently. Mrs. Pennington, fear. Major Graham, guilt. Edward Tolland, vanity. Harold Finch, nervousness. Lydia Wren, envy. Next to Lydia's name she wrote one more word, opportunity. Later that night Miss Marple received a quiet visitor, Harold Finch, pale and anxious. "I shouldn't come, I know," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "But I can't sleep, Miss Marple. I've been thinking. Perhaps I know who might have done it." She looked up calmly. "Do sit down, Mr. Finch. You mustn't let fear make you foolish." He sat trembling. "It's Miss Wren. She came to see Mrs. Pennington often, more than anyone realized. I once overheard them quarreling in the tea-room before it opened. She said something like, 'You owe me that much after what you've done.' Mrs. Pennington told her never to speak of it again." Miss Marple listened without interruption. When he finished, she said quietly, "You've done well to tell me. Fear can be useful when it leads to honesty." As he left, Miss Marple poured herself one final cup of tea. The rain had begun again, tapping gently at the glass, a rhythm as steady as her own thoughts. She no longer needed to guess at motives or means. They were all there, neatly arranged like patterns in lace. Mrs. Pennington had not been killed by a stranger, or by greed alone. She had been killed by resentment, by a woman who mistook envy for justice and bitterness for strength. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the time to act. But not by accusation. No, Miss Marple preferred the quieter methods, the kind that let people condemn themselves. She would invite them all to tea. A proper tea in daylight with sugar for those who dared to take it. As she set down her cup, she allowed herself a soft sigh. "There's nothing so revealing," she murmured, "as watching how people behave when they believe the danger has passed." The next day broke with a deceptive brightness, a soft morning light that fell over St. Mildred's, as if the world itself wished to forget what had taken place within it. Birds chirped in the hedgerows, milkmen clinked their bottles along the lanes, and the ordinary hum of life returned. Yet beneath that surface calm, something uneasy lingered, a faint tremor in the air like the echo of a storm not yet spent. Miss Marple felt it as she laid out her best lace tablecloth, the one she saved for special guests, and polished the silver spoons until they gleamed. She had invited them all, the Reverend and Mrs. Blythe, Harold Finch, Lydia Wren, and Edward Tolland, to tea that afternoon. It was, she had told them, her small way of easing the tension after the dreadful events of the week. None could refuse, though each wondered privately what she truly intended. By 4 o'clock they were gathered in her sitting room, the air scented with warm scones and freshly cut roses. Miss Marple, looking every inch the gracious hostess, poured tea with practised gentleness, her manner mild and pleasant. Only Inspector Craddock, who had accepted her invitation at her insistence, seemed to grasp the undercurrent beneath her domestic charm. He sat quietly by the window, notebook discreetly in hand. "How lovely, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blythe said with a sigh as she accepted her cup. "It's such a comfort to have a bit of normality again. We've all been so shaken, haven't we?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, stirring her own tea. "Death is rather a rude interruption to routine, don't you think? It forces people to reveal more of themselves than they'd prefer." The remark passed over the guests with an uneasy chuckle. Edward Tolland smiled thinly, leaning back in his chair. "You've quite the philosophical turn of mind, Miss Marple. Though I must say the village could do with a little less speculation these days. It's bad for trade, you know." "Trade?" Lydia Wren asked sharply. "You mean your flirtations with every woman who walks past your gate?" He raised an eyebrow, amused. "My dear, jealousy doesn't become you." Lydia's cheeks flushed. "Jealousy has nothing to do with it. I simply find hypocrisy distasteful." Now, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on her teapot. "We mustn't quarrel over trifles. We've had enough bitterness lately." She set the pot down, her tone deceptively gentle. "Sugar, anyone?" There was a brief pause. Harold Finch glanced at the bowl as though it were a coiled snake. Mrs. Blythe shook her head at once. "No, thank you," she said hastily. "I've rather lost my taste for sweetness since the tragedy." "How understandable," Miss Marple replied, her voice serene. "One learns to be cautious, especially when one's safety depends upon knowing when to refuse." She stirred her tea again, her expression mild as ever. "Do you know," she went on conversationally, "it's curious how something as simple as sugar can reveal so much about a person. Some take it without thinking, others hesitate, and some add it to another's cup with purpose." Lydia's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her saucer. "I really don't see what you mean." "No? Then let me tell you a little story. Once, in a small village rather like ours, a lady of some means was killed at her own table. The police believed it was the work of a stranger, a jealous lover or a greedy friend. But it turned out the cause was much simpler. The poison had been hidden where it would seem most innocent, among the sweetness, and it was placed there not by greed or passion, but by envy, quiet creeping envy that had festered for years, waiting for a chance to act. The room was still. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to hesitate. Edward Tolland's smile had faded entirely. Harold Finch swallowed audibly. Lydia Wren's eyes darted toward the window. Miss Marple went on, her voice calm but carrying. "You see, the lady who died had once done a kindness to another, a woman of intelligence and ambition, but with a sharp sense of pride. She'd tried to help her, perhaps even promised her something she later withdrew. That sort of disappointment can feel like betrayal to a proud soul. And when that woman discovered the fear her benefactor lived under, she used it. She frightened her further, made her clumsy with dread, and then placed the means of death where it would seem an accident, or a fitting retribution." Lydia stood abruptly, her chair scraping the rug. "Are you suggesting—" Miss Marple looked up at her with an expression of mild surprise. "My dear Miss Wren, I haven't named anyone. But you mean me, don't you?" Lydia's voice trembled, though whether with anger or fear was unclear. "You think I killed her because I envied her? Because she refused to help me?" Craddock spoke at last, his tone even. "No one has accused you, Miss Wren, but perhaps it would help if you told us what she refused." Lydia's hands clenched at her sides. For a moment she seemed about to speak. Then she shook her head fiercely. "It doesn't matter. It was nothing." Miss Marple sighed softly, folding her hands. "Nothing rarely leaves such deep marks on the heart, my dear. But perhaps I can remind you. Mrs. Pennington once promised to recommend you for a position, did she not? A teaching post in London?" Lydia's lips parted, her composure faltering. "She told me she would, yes. But she changed her mind. She said I wasn't suited. She said I lacked discretion. And that stung, didn't it?" Miss Marple said gently. "Because you prided yourself on being discreet. You saw everything, heard everything, but never told. Until she mocked that very talent. You wanted her to feel small just once. And so when you discovered she had those parcels, you told the story of the almond scent, knowing it would link her to poison. Then, when she began to fear exposure, you made certain she would take the poisoned sugar herself." Lydia's breath came quick and shallow. "That's absurd. You can't prove anything." "No, I cannot," Miss Marple agreed, her tone still mild. "But you can." She nodded toward the tea table. "You see, I refilled that sugar bowl myself this morning after the police had sealed away the evidence. But I noticed something odd when I cleaned it. The lid. Do you recall, Inspector, the faint print on the underside?" Craddock nodded. "It matched a ring pattern," Miss Marple continued, "from a very distinctive piece of jewellery, a silver band with a small engraved lily. I noticed you wear such a ring, Miss Wren. It's rather unique." Lydia glanced down instinctively, then snatched her hand to her chest. "That proves nothing." "I touched it once, days ago, after it was poisoned," Miss Marple asked softly. "Or before?" There was silence, only the sound of the rain beginning again, light against the windows. Lydia's shoulders sagged. She looked suddenly older, her defiance draining away like colour from a photograph. "She deserved it," she whispered. "She toyed with people's lives. She pretended to help, but she never meant it. She laughed at me. She said I was a small woman, meant for small things. I wanted her to see how wrong she was." Craddock rose quietly, signalling to the constable who had been waiting outside. "You'll have to come with us, Miss Wren." Lydia didn't resist. She allowed herself to be led from the room, her eyes vacant. The others sat frozen, unable to meet one another's gaze. After they had gone, Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, her movements calm once more. "It's a pity," she said softly. "She might have done well with a little encouragement. But envy is a dreadful weight to carry. It corrodes everything it touches." Mrs. Blythe dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "How did you know, Miss Marple?" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "people are really very much the same everywhere. I once knew a woman who poisoned her neighbour's cat, simply because it caught more birds than her own. She too used sweetness to disguise her malice. The principle, you see, never changes." As the guests departed, subdued and shaken, Miss Marple sat alone by the window, watching the rain fall over the quiet village. The tea-room across the way stood dark and empty now, its windows reflecting the grey sky. She thought of Mrs. Pennington, vain, secretive, fearful, and of Lydia Wren, clever and envious, caught in the tangle of her own bitterness. At last she sighed and lifted her cup, savouring the warmth. "Human nature," she murmured, "is much like tea. It shows its true strength only when it's in hot water." The following days passed in a peculiar quiet. St. Mildred's, usually so alive with the gentle bustle of everyday life, seemed to hold its breath. Lydia Wren's arrest had silenced the village more effectively than any sermon or scandal ever could. The bell at St. Mildred's church tolled each morning as usual, but the sound carried differently now, as though even the air had grown cautious of what it might disturb. In the tea shop, in the grocer's, at the post office counter, conversation stopped the instant Miss Marple's name was mentioned. People spoke of her now with a mixture of reverence and unease, as though she were not entirely of this world, but a quiet force that saw too much and pitied too little. Yet in her small cottage on the edge of the green, Miss Marple moved through her days with her usual calm precision. She tended her garden, mended a bit of lace, and wrote her letters in neat looping script. She neither sought attention nor avoided it. Only Inspector Craddock, who came often under the pretext of tying up loose ends, noticed that she seemed more thoughtful than triumphant. He found her one morning kneeling among her roses, pruning shears glinting in the pale light. "I should think you'd be pleased, Miss Marple," he said, offering her the day's paper. "They're calling it a tidy resolution. The papers love a neat confession." She accepted the paper but did not open it. "Confessions, Inspector, are like lace, pretty to look at but full of holes." Miss Wren confessed, yes, but I wonder if she quite knew what she was confessing to. Craddock frowned. "You mean she lied?" "Not exactly," she said, rising with a small wince. "I mean that people sometimes tell the truth for the wrong reasons. It brings them a certain peace, even if it's not the whole truth. Lydia Wren wanted her pain recognized, not her guilt absolved." Craddock rubbed his chin. "But she admitted to poisoning Mrs. Pennington. The prints on the lid, the motive, it all fits." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, brushing a petal from her sleeve. "It fits perhaps too comfortably, and yet there are seams that still show. I can't help thinking of that fingerprint on the underside of the lid where no one would touch unless they lifted it to pour something in. Lydia would have had no reason to be so careful. She was proud of her act, not meticulous. But someone else, someone watching, might have been." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You think someone tampered with the evidence?" She smiled faintly. "Not tampered, Inspector, arranged. There is a difference. Lydia's envy was real enough, but envy alone seldom brings murder. It takes a push, a whisper in the right ear, a nudge toward a fatal idea." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I ought to be used to this by now. Every time I think you're finished, you start again. Who then gave her that push?" "That," she said softly, "is precisely what I mean to find out." Later that afternoon she took her walking stick and set out toward the rectory. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and the gravel crunched beneath her shoes. Reverend Blythe greeted her at the door, all pastoral warmth and polite fatigue. His wife was not at home, he said, but he was delighted to offer tea. He talked easily, too easily, and about the affair, about sin and repentance, and about the frailty of the human spirit. Miss Marple listened, nodding in all the right places, but her mind was elsewhere. She noted the faint streak of ash on the hearth-rug, the sort left by recently burnt paper. "Your sermon on Sunday was very fine," she said mildly. "Forgiveness is a difficult thing." The Reverend smiled. "We must all learn it, Miss Marple. Even poor Lydia. The Lord will grant her peace. And Mrs. Pennington?" she asked quietly. He hesitated just long enough. "Her sins were her own, I imagine. None of us are fit to judge the dead." When she left, Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly toward the churchyard. There, among the yews, stood Mrs. Blythe speaking earnestly with Harold Finch. It was not the first time Miss Marple had seen them together, though most in the village would have thought it improbable. The timid clerk and the vicar's wife, an odd pair unless there was something they shared. She watched for a moment longer before turning home. That evening, as twilight deepened, Inspector Craddock returned. He found Miss Marple seated by the fire, knitting in her lap. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The forensics came back. There was another set of partial prints on the sugar bowl under Lydia's, very faint but definitely male." She nodded, as though this confirmed a private certainty. "And not Mr. Tollins, I presume?" "No," Craddock said grimly. "Harold Finch." "Ah," she murmured. "Poor man. He never could stop fidgeting with things that weren't his." Craddock stared. "You knew?" "Not knew, Inspector. Suspected. You see, I could not reconcile Harold's nervousness with innocence. True fear, real fear, makes people careful. He was only panicked. That suggested guilt of a sort. But why would he help Lydia Wren?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she answered. "He wouldn't have helped her knowingly. He fancied her, perhaps even pitied her. She told him a sad story, how Mrs. Pennington had ruined her prospects, how she deserved to be avenged. And Harold, poor foolish Harold, thought he might earn her affection by being useful. Perhaps he handled the sugar bowl when she wasn't looking. Perhaps he even placed the poison she had supplied, not realizing what it was. But when he saw the result, when he saw Mrs. Pennington collapse, he understood. And fear once awakened is a terrible master, Craddock swore under his breath. You think Lydia manipulated him? Of course, but I also think someone manipulated her. Lydia was clever, yes, but not bold. Someone fed her resentment, turned her jealousy into a weapon. He looked puzzled. Who could that be? Miss Marple set her knitting aside and met his gaze. I believe we shall find the answer not among the sinners, but among the pious. The Reverend speaks too easily of forgiveness, as though it were something already earned. That night, while the village slept, Miss Marple wrote 2 letters. One went to the diocesan office, requesting information about Reverend Blythe's previous parishes. The other went to an acquaintance in London, a retired solicitor who owed her a favour. Then she banked her fire, turned down her lamp and sat in the darkness listening to the rain. By the next afternoon the replies had come. The first told of a quiet scandal years before, a parish in Devon, a woman of means and the Reverend's unseemly entanglement with her finances. The second contained a single line confirming that Mrs. Pennington's late husband had once been that very woman's solicitor. Miss Marple read both letters twice, folded them neatly and placed them in her desk. The circle, she thought, had closed. When she called on the vicarage again, she found Reverend Blythe alone in his study. The fire burned high, though the day was mild. She stood by the mantel, examining a photograph on the shelf, the Reverend in his younger years beside a man in uniform. "Your brother, perhaps?" she asked pleasantly. He glanced up sharply. "Yes, he died in India." "How very sad," she said. "I suppose that's where you first met the Penningtons. Your names appear together in a rather old parish record from Bombay, you know. You performed their wedding, didn't you?" His face paled. "You've been prying." "I've been curious," she corrected gently. "I imagine Mrs. Pennington was quite shocked to see you again here in St. Mildred's. The Reverend who knew too much about her first marriage, her financial dealings, her missteps. She might even have paid you to remain silent. And when she refused to continue, you found another means of persuasion. A woman already jealous enough to serve your purpose." "That's absurd," he said, his voice rising. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do." She withdrew one of the letters and laid it on his desk. "Oh, see, the bank in London still keeps records. A transfer, small but regular, from Mrs. Pennington to an account in your name. Until 3 months ago when it stopped." For a long moment he stared at the letter, his composure slipping. Then he sank into his chair, his voice hoarse. "I only meant to frighten her, to make her see what she owed me." Lydia took it too far. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Evil seldom travels alone, Reverend. It needs company, someone to open the door, someone to hold the light." When Inspector Craddock arrived half an hour later, he found the Reverend sitting motionless, his confession already written out in Miss Marple's neat hand. She sat nearby, pouring tea for them both. "It seems," she said quietly as Craddock took the paper, "that truth, like tea, must sometimes be coaxed to draw properly. It takes patience, warmth, and just the right pressure." Outside the rain had stopped, and the village of St. Mildred's exhaled again, not in relief but in weary recognition that peace, when it returned, would never quite be the same. Miss Marple watched the first hint of sunlight break through the clouds, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. Human nature, she thought, was a pot forever on the boil, and sooner or later it always whistled. It was the following morning when the church bells tolled over St. Mildred's, their sound oddly hollow beneath a sky streaked with pale gold. The news of Reverend Blythe's confession had settled like a heavy mist, neither quite believed nor entirely doubted. People spoke of it softly in corners, the way they spoke of illness or of sin. To some it was justice, to others tragedy, but to Miss Marple it was not yet the end. A puzzle may appear complete, she thought, yet a missing piece can change the whole picture. Inspector Craddock stopped by after breakfast, his boots damp from the dew. He looked both tired and unsettled. "The Crown Prosecutor's satisfied," he said, standing awkwardly by her hearth. "The Reverend's statement matches the evidence." He admits to blackmail, to frightening Mrs. Pennington, to knowing Lydia would act rashly. That's motive enough. They'll charge him as accessory before the fact. Miss Marple nodded slowly, though her knitting needles paused mid-air. Accessory, yes, but not murderer. Poor Lydia's bitterness was only a spark. The flame came from somewhere else. The Reverend played upon her envy, yes, yet I keep wondering who placed the poison in her hands. Craddock frowned. "You think there's someone else still?" "I think there always is," she replied, her tone mild. "Someone quieter, cleverer, who lets others take the blame." She looked toward the window where the garden shimmered faintly with morning light. The Reverend was desperate, not calculating. But there was calculation in this, Inspector, a kind of artistry. Poisoners are rarely impulsive. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "If there is another hand in it, I can't see it. We've questioned everyone. Only Edward Tolland remains unaccounted for. He's packed up and gone to London." "Gone?" Her eyes sharpened. How sudden of him. And on such a modest income, too. Moving to London is not a trifle. Craddock nodded grimly. "Left on the early train. Said he'd business to attend to, nothing suspicious. But I'll telegraph the yard to keep watch." When he departed, Miss Marple sat very still for a long time. The clock ticked, the kettle hummed, and she thought back to Tolland's careless charm, to his visit the day before the murder, to the faint scent that had clung to his gloves when he offered her a light. Almonds. It had struck her then as peculiar, but she had not pursued it. A man like Tolland was easy to overlook. Amiable, self-assured, frivolous. Yet in her long life she had learned that frivolity, when paired with charm, could conceal the darkest intentions. By afternoon she was on the 2:15 train to London herself, a shawl folded neatly about her shoulders, and a small carpet-bag at her feet. She did not tell Craddock. He would have insisted on accompanying her, and she preferred quiet observation to official company. Through the carriage window, the countryside rolled past in muted greens and browns, the landscape growing denser as they neared the city. She thought of Mrs. Pennington, the poised widow, the faint tremor in her hand that night, the unspoken terror in her eyes. Fear, yes, but not of Lydia or the Reverend. Fear of someone who had already bested her once. In London, she went first to a small hotel off Bloomsbury Square, where she had stayed once during the war. The clerk recognized her at once. "A room, Miss Marple? Still quiet on the upper floor?" "Perfectly suitable," she said, signing the register in her firm hand. "Tell me, do you still serve tea at 4:30?" "Of course, madam," she smiled. "Then I'll be down promptly. And if a Mr. Edward Tolland should happen to be staying here, perhaps you might mention that an old acquaintance of Mrs. Pennington's is in town." The clerk blinked, uncertain, but nodded politely. Miss Marple climbed the stairs without another word. She knew the rest would follow. Indeed, by the time she had poured her second cup that afternoon, Tolland appeared, immaculately dressed, a touch too cheerful. "Well, Miss Marple, what a coincidence. I hadn't expected to see anyone from St. Mildred's so soon." "Coincidence," she echoed softly. "Such a curious word. Fate so often disguises design." He laughed, seating himself opposite her. "Still fond of your puzzles, I see. You mustn't look so suspicious, my dear lady. I've merely come to town on business. A small inheritance to settle. From Mrs. Pennington's estate, perhaps." The laughter faltered. "Now that's unkind. Surely you don't think—" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that you are a man accustomed to opportunity. And Mrs. Pennington, for all her elegance, was terribly vulnerable to flattery. You knew she feared the Reverend's hold over her. You encouraged it. You gave Lydia Wren the poison, telling her it was only something to frighten her rival. And when the deed was done, you vanished, just as you once vanished from the colonies after a scandal involving another widow's fortune. Tolland stared at her, colour draining from his face. So you have no proof? Oh, but I shall, she said, setting down her cup. You see, Mrs. Pennington confided in someone, perhaps without realizing it. Her lawyer in Market Brougham holds a letter she sent the night before her death, naming the man she feared most. He telephoned me this morning. He rose abruptly. You're bluffing, am I? Her tone was mild as ever. I told the inspector you were vain, Mr. Tolland, and vanity, I'm afraid, is the ruin of every clever criminal. You'll not flee far. Your reflection will always follow you. He hesitated, then turned sharply and strode toward the door. But a uniformed constable stepped into the doorway before he reached it. Craddock's voice came from behind. She never travels alone, Mr. Tolland. The arrest itself was quiet. There was no scene, only the faint rustle of Miss Marple's skirt as she stood, folding her shawl. Later, when the inspector joined her in the empty tea-room, he found her gazing out at the rain-slicked street. You might have warned me, he said. I did, she replied serenely. You simply weren't ready to listen. Policemen prefer their villains repentant, not charming. Craddock exhaled slowly. The letter, did it really exist? Oh, yes, she said, smiling faintly. But it named no one. Only a line. The man who laughs too easily has found me again. That was enough. The journey back to St. Mildred's was quiet. She watched the countryside slip by, washed clean by the rain, and felt no triumph, only a kind of gentle sorrow. There were no victors in such affairs, only survivors. Lydia Wren would live out her days behind grey walls, her envy turned inward. The Reverend would die disgraced. And Edward Tolland, whose charm had once delighted half the village, would find himself among men who neither admired nor believed him. When she arrived home, the air smelled of wet earth and roses. She lit her fire, set the kettle to boil, and laid her garden gloves aside. The evening light spilled softly across her parlour, catching the delicate lace curtains and the framed photograph of her long-gone nephew. For a while she sat listening to the ticking clock, the simple rhythm of order restored. But even as peace returned, she knew it would not last. Evil, she often thought, was not some grand design of villains. It was a series of small cruelties, tiny deceits allowed to fester. It hid itself in smiles, in compliments, in the sweetness of tea. When the kettle began to sing, she rose and poured herself a cup. And so it ends, she murmured. Or perhaps it only pauses. She stirred in a single spoonful of sugar, watching it dissolve, and smiled to herself, a small, secret smile that belonged to those who understood the fragile balance between kindness and knowledge. Outside, the first stars appeared over St. Mildred's, and the village, unaware of its narrow escape from darkness, settled once more into its comforting routines. In the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple sipped her tea and closed her eyes, already hearing in her mind the faint echo of another mystery taking shape. Somewhere beyond the horizon of that peaceful lee, English night, the quiet that settled over St. Mildred's in the days following Edward Tolland's arrest felt different from the hush that had come after Lydia Wren's confession. Then the silence had been heavy with disbelief, the villagers stunned by the sudden unmasking of someone they had known and trusted. Now the air was lighter, relieved perhaps, yet tinged with something like embarrassment, as though the entire village had been caught in a grand illusion. They spoke of the matter less with horror than with a kind of weary resignation. A man like Mr. Tolland, they murmured, always seemed too good to be true. Gossip, having feasted, now merely picked its teeth. Miss Marple listened to these murmurs from her garden gate, smiling politely but offering little herself. She had long ago learned that silence in a village was the most eloquent reply. She spent her mornings trimming the late roses and her afternoons knitting by the fire, content to let the world imagine she was resting after her exertions. Yet Inspector Craddock, who knew her too well, was not deceived. He arrived one drizzly afternoon, hat in hand, his expression half amused and half concerned. "I've been too quiet," he said without preamble, taking the chair opposite her. "Whenever you go silent, I start to suspect you're thinking of something I've missed." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with that innocent mildness that had unstrung so many confident men. "My dear Inspector, I've merely been contemplating the nature of endings. They're never quite as final as people like to think." Craddock leaned forward. "You don't mean to tell me there's still something left undone in this business?" Tolland's confession was complete. He even admitted to supplying the poison. "Ah, but confession," she murmured, "is rather like tea. It must be steeped before it reveals its true strength." Edward Tolland confessed to the part he thought could be proven. He was a coward, not a fool. "I dare say there was more he preferred left unspoken." The inspector frowned. "More? You think there was someone above even him?" "Not above," she said softly, "beside. A partnership of sorts, one that began long before any of us noticed." She set her knitting aside and met his gaze. "Tell me, Inspector, who first introduced Mrs. Pennington to our dear Mr. Tolland?" Craddock blinked. "Introduced? Why, come to think of it, it was Mrs. Blythe. She arranged the committee for the church fete last spring, and he offered to donate a prize. She insisted Mrs. Pennington should help." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "and Mrs. Blythe, as we know, is a woman of impeccable social sense and unerring calculation. She has always struck me as someone who enjoys arranging people almost as much as flowers, placing them just so until they look quite perfect. But sometimes, you see, the arrangement hides the thorns." Craddock straightened. "So you can't mean Mrs. Blythe was involved?" "I mean only that she understood more than she ever admitted," Miss Marple replied. "You remember how quickly she mentioned those mysterious parcels from London? How conveniently she recalled the smell of almonds, something she claimed Miss Wren had told her, though Miss Wren, when pressed, denied ever saying so. Mrs. Blythe was very careful to direct suspicion elsewhere from the start. I should like to know why." The inspector rubbed his chin. "She's the vicar's wife, for heaven's sake." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear, I have lived long enough to know that virtue is sometimes worn as a cloak. It conceals the coldest ambitions. That evening, when the lamps were being lit across the village, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Blythe received her graciously, though there was a faint stiffness in her welcome. She poured tea with practiced precision, her smile brittle at the edges. "You must be glad it's all over, Miss Marple," she said brightly. "Such an unpleasant business. The whole thing has been dreadful for poor Samuel." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I've always thought tragedy reveals character. The Reverend's conduct, though unfortunate, showed a certain weakness of the spirit rather than of principle. One might almost pity him." Mrs. Blythe's hand faltered slightly as she lifted her cup. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but her words deliberate. "That's curious, isn't it? How two people can share a household and yet hide so much from one another. I suppose he didn't tell you about his correspondence with Mrs. Pennington?" A faint colour rose in Mrs. Blythe's cheeks. "He told me nothing of the sort." "No, of course he wouldn't," Miss Marple said, studying her hostess over the rim of her cup. "But you knew all the same. You found one of her letters before he destroyed it. You realized she had something over him, something that might disgrace you both. That must have been difficult, Mrs. Blythe, after all your years of careful management." Mrs. Blythe's teacup rattled faintly as she set it down. "I don't understand what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "You've always been a woman of order. You couldn't bear the thought of scandal. You saw how your husband's past might undo the position you'd built here. So you acted. You encouraged his resentment of Mrs. Pennington, whispered to him that she meant to ruin him. And when he hesitated, you found another way, through Mr. Tolland, who already owed you a debt of gratitude." Mrs. Blythe's composure cracked. "A debt?" "Yes, he was once a guest at your cousin's estate, was he not? The same cousin who conveniently lent you money when the church roof needed repairing. Edward Tolland repays kindness in favours and secrets. There was a long silence. The clock ticked. Finally Mrs. Blythe said, her voice barely above a whisper, "You can't prove any of this." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I have no wish to. Proof is for the police. I'm only concerned with understanding. It helps me sleep at night." She rose, adjusting her shawl. "But you mustn't worry. The truth, as I see it, will stay where it belongs. We older women, after all, know the value of discretion." When she left the vicarage, the evening air was sharp, smelling faintly of rain and smoke. She walked slowly, leaning on her stick, thinking of Mrs. Blythe's trembling hands and the dull terror behind her eyes. Miss Marple knew she would not see that woman again. Not outside the church pews, at least. There are punishments the law cannot administer, the quiet, lingering ones that settle into the heart. Back at her cottage, she found Craddock waiting by the gate. "You've been busy," he said, though he smiled wryly. "I had a feeling you wouldn't rest." "I only paid a call," she replied. "Courtesy, you know," he studied her face. "There's something you're not saying." "There always is, Inspector. But this time perhaps it's best left unsaid. Some truths do no good once spoken. The village has had enough of scandal." He nodded slowly. "You're sure she won't run?" "She won't," Miss Marple said. "Her prison is already built. It stands behind lace curtains and church bells." They stood in silence a moment, listening to the rustle of wind through the hedges. Then Craddock said quietly, "You've done it again, Miss Marple. You've managed to bring order out of chaos." She shook her head. "No, Inspector. Only understanding. Order belongs to God." When he left, she went inside and lit the fire. The kettle began its low hum, and she took down her worn notebook from the mantel. On the final page, she wrote a single line beneath the last entry. "Evil grows best in tidy gardens." She closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, washing over the cobblestones as though cleansing the village of its recent sins. But Miss Marple knew better. Nothing in human nature was ever truly washed away. It merely went underground, waiting for warmth and sunlight to bloom once more. As she sipped her tea, she thought of the faces that had passed through her cottage in these few short weeks. Mrs. Pennington's brittle charm, Lydia Wren's pride, Tolland's smiling deceit, the Reverend's cowardice and Mrs. Blythe's terrible calm, all threads in the same tapestry, each pulling the others tighter until something broke. She sighed softly. "It is always the same," she murmured. "Pride, fear, envy, and vanity. Each thinks itself innocent until the moment it's caught by its own reflection." The fire crackled, and the old clock chimed the hour. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth seep into her hands. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's tolled for evening prayer, their sound floating over the darkened village like a benediction. Somewhere within those echoes lay both forgiveness and warning, the eternal rhythm of human folly repeating itself, as constant and familiar as the taste of tea brewed just a moment too long. The rain fell harder that night, as if the heavens themselves were determined to scrub away the last stains of deceit from St. Mildred's. It beat upon the slate roofs and pattered against cottage windows, a steady, cleansing rhythm. Miss Marple listened from her sitting room, her fire burning low, her knitting abandoned in her lap. The case, as the village believed, was over. Justice, in the official sense, had been served. And yet, as she watched the droplets slide down the glass, she could not help but feel that something still lingered, a quiet unease, like a final note that refused to fade. She had seen it before, too many times to count, a crime neatly concluded, the guilty named and punished, and yet the village did not sleep easy. There was always some echo, some unspoken residue that clung to those who remained. This, she thought, was the true aftermath of evil, not the act itself, but the way it seeped into ordinary life, changing the flavor of the air, the rhythm of the days. Outside, the church bell tolled softly for the 9 o'clock prayers. She could imagine Mrs. Blythe there, sitting rigid in the front pew, her gloved hands clasped too tightly. That poor woman imprisoned now not by walls but by conscience. Miss Marple pitied her, though she knew pity was a luxury one must exercise with care. People like Mrs. Blythe were too proud to accept it, and yet too broken to survive without it. When the last chime faded, there came a knock at her door. She knew before she opened it that it would be Inspector Craddock. There was a certain rhythm to his visits, always coming just when she thought him done. He entered with his usual blend of respect and exasperation, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair by the hearth. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, pouring him tea. "You look troubled, Inspector." He gave a short laugh. "You'd make a fine detective yourself if you ever took to it seriously." "I should hope I already do," she said with a faint smile. "Now what brings you out in such weather?" He hesitated, his eyes on the flames. "It's the Reverend. He's taken ill. Heart failure, they say. Died in his sleep early this morning." Miss Marple set down her cup gently. "How very sudden. Though perhaps not unexpected. You don't seem surprised." "Guilt is a heavy thing to carry," she murmured. He was not a strong man, either in spirit or constitution. Sometimes a heart gives out simply from too much shame. Craddock nodded, staring into the fire. Mrs. Blythe was with him when he went. She sent for the doctor, but it was no use. Funny thing is, the doctor mentioned something odd. The brandy decanter by his bedside was almost empty. She said he'd been restless, couldn't sleep. It's possible he took too much. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. Or was given too much. He looked sharply at her. "You think—" She shook her head. "I think Mrs. Blythe loved her reputation more than her husband, but I doubt she'd stoop to another crime. Still, grief takes peculiar forms, especially when mixed with relief." Craddock sighed. "There'll be an inquest, of course. But between you and me, I think the village's appetite for scandal has worn thin." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Scandal is much like sugar. It dissolves quickly once exposed to the air." For a time they sat in companionable silence. The fire crackled, the rain softened, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Then Craddock spoke again, more quietly. "You know, Miss Marple, I sometimes wonder how you do it. You see through people as if they were made of glass. Doesn't it tire you?" "Oh, frequently," she said with a small laugh. "But one can't help seeing what one sees. It's a matter of observation, not effort. People are so very revealing, you know. They wear their sins like badges, even when they believe them hidden." He smiled faintly. "And what of yourself, then? Do you ever tire of living among so many secrets?" "Not at all," she said. "A village without secrets would be dreadfully dull. Besides, secrets are rather like weeds. They keep one's garden from becoming too complacent." He rose after another cup, thanked her, and took his leave. When he had gone, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching his figure disappear down the lane. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones gleaming under the lamplight. She thought again of the Reverend, of Mrs. Blythe, and of the strange cyclical nature of sin. One act of deceit always bred another, like ivy creeping along a wall. The next morning dawned cold and clear. The village awoke to the sound of the church bell tolling once more, this time for the Reverend's funeral. Miss Marple attended, of course, dressed in sombre grey. The small congregation filled the pews, their faces pale and drawn. Mrs. Blythe sat alone in the front row, her black veil trembling slightly. She did not look around once, not even when the coffin passed before her. After the service, as the mourners gathered in the churchyard, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Mrs. Blythe stood perfectly still beside the grave, but her eyes were not on the coffin. They were fixed upon the rectory window, where the curtains fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. It was only a moment, but Miss Marple felt the chill of it. Some people, she thought, are haunted not by ghosts but by what remains of themselves. Later, when the others had gone, she lingered by the grave. Inspector Craddock joined her, his hat in his hands. "It's finished now," he said quietly. "Is it ever?" she replied. "Evil doesn't end with the death of the guilty, Inspector. It simply changes shape. But perhaps that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes remorse is the only form of redemption left to us." He glanced at her sideways. "You sound almost forgiving," she smiled faintly. "Forgiveness is practical, Inspector. One must forgive to go on living. But forgetting, well, that's quite another matter." He left her then, and she walked home alone through the crisp air. The village felt strangely peaceful, as though exhaling after a long-held breath. The tea-room, once the scene of gaiety and death alike, now stood shuttered, a faint scent of bergamot still clinging to the doorway. Miss Marple paused there, remembering the laughter, the music, the moment the stranger had entered, and everything had changed. It all seemed distant now, as though it had happened to another world. When she reached her cottage, she went straight to her writing desk. From a drawer she took the small notebook she always kept, its pages filled with neat, slanting handwriting. On the last page, she added one more note beneath the others. "Closure seldom comes from punishment. It comes from truth accepted quietly." She closed the book, then lit her lamp and set the kettle on the stove. The sound of it boiling was comfortingly familiar, a reminder that life, for all its cruelties, continued in small, steadfast ways. The clock chimed 7. She poured her tea, added a single cube of sugar, and smiled faintly at the swirl it made as it dissolved. Outside, the stars were beginning to pierce the twilight. The village was returning to its rhythm, shops closing, lamps glowing, the faint murmur of distant voices. It was once again the quiet little world it had always been. Yet beneath that calm, Miss Marple knew the lessons of recent days would linger. People would look at one another differently now, perhaps more kindly, perhaps with a little more caution. And that, she thought, was all to the good. She settled into her chair, her knitting once more in her lap, and began to work the familiar pattern. The wool slid smoothly through her fingers, stitch by careful stitch. Outside, an owl called softly from the trees, and the night deepened around her cottage. Miss Marple worked on, her thoughts steady, her eyes calm. The world, she knew, would never run short of its little mysteries, but for tonight she was content to let them rest. And so the village of St. Mildred slept, its gardens glistening beneath the moonlight, its secrets buried for now beneath the soft earth. Somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed faintly through the hills, a promise of other stories, other lives. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her hands never pausing. "Yes," she murmured, almost to the firelight, "there will always be another." The days that followed brought a deep stillness to St. Mildred's, the kind that lingers after a storm. The villagers returned to their familiar rhythms, church on Sunday, market on Wednesday, tea with neighbours on Thursdays. But something in their laughter had changed. It was quieter now, thoughtful, as though each person had glimpsed a corner of darkness and preferred not to look too closely again. Miss Marple noticed it in their eyes when they greeted her on the lane. Gratitude perhaps mixed with the faintest unease. She never minded that look. It was the natural result of truth emerging from polite deceit. A village, she often thought, was like lace, lovely at a distance but full of holes when held to the light. The final threads of the case came together quietly. Edward Tolland's trial proceeded swiftly in London. The jury found him guilty of murder by manipulation and deceit, though his own hand had never touched the poison. His final statement to the court was characteristically charming, a speech about fate, about love twisted into tragedy. Fate might have swayed some, but not those who had heard Miss Marple's account of him. The judge called it murder by proxy, a gentleman's crime executed with cowardice. The Reverend's death was ruled natural, the official line being that remorse had hastened his failing heart. Mrs. Blythe withdrew from public life, selling the vicarage and departing to live with a sister by the sea. Her absence was felt like a silence that no one wished to break. Lydia Wren, meanwhile, remained in prison, but Miss Marple received word that she had taken up reading for the blind, a quiet, penitent occupation. When Miss Marple heard it, she nodded, satisfied. Redemption, she murmured, often comes to those who cannot yet forgive themselves. One bright morning in late summer, Inspector Craddock visited her once more. He found her in the garden, pruning her roses with her usual precision. The air was rich with the scent of earth and cut petals. He lingered a moment before speaking, watching how her steady hands worked among the thorns. "It's all wrapped up now," he said. "Tarland hanged last week. I thought you'd want to know." She didn't look up. "Justice," she said softly, "is rarely as tidy as we hope. Still, perhaps it will bring some peace to those who need it." Craddock nodded, uncomfortable. He never quite knew what to say when she spoke that way, not coldly, but with a kind of sadness that came from understanding too much. "There's one thing I still don't quite grasp," he admitted. "How did you know Tarland was the one pulling the strings?" "There was no proof until that letter turned up." She smiled faintly, slipping off her gloves. "It was quite simple, really. Everyone else in the affair behaved as human nature dictated, fearfully, foolishly, impulsively. Only Tarland remained calm. True guilt always leaves a mark, Inspector, even when it's hidden. But vanity? Vanity is spotless." He admired himself far too much to imagine anyone could see through him. Craddock chuckled. "I suppose it's a good thing you never took to crime, Miss Marple." "My dear Inspector," she said, turning toward the house, "if I had, I'd never have been caught." That evening, as dusk deepened and the garden fell into quiet shadow, she sat by her window with a single candle burning beside her. Outside, the air was soft with the scent of rain-washed leaves. From the churchyard drifted the faint toll of the bell, not in mourning this time, but in simple ritual. A comfort, a reminder of ordinary life continuing. She thought of Mrs. Pennington, so elegant and fearful, of Lydia Wren, clever and wounded, of the Reverend, proud and weak, of Tarland, charming and hollow. Each of them had been undone not by wickedness alone, but by something far more ordinary, human folly. And that, she reflected, was what always fascinated her. Evil, in her experience, rarely arrived dressed in malice. It came wearing politeness, good manners, and sometimes even affection. One only had to look closely enough to see the crack beneath the glaze. The candle flickered as a soft breeze moved through the room. She closed her notebook, the one where she had written each detail, each observation, and placed it neatly in the drawer beside her armchair. Then she took up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly in the quiet. Outside, St. Mildred's glowed faintly under the moon, its rooftops silvered, its streets empty save for the slow gait of the constable making his rounds. Life, as it always did, resumed its gentle pace. There would be another scandal some day, another mystery to disturb its peace, for such things were inevitable where people lived close together and pretended to know one another fully. But for now the village slept, dreaming perhaps of simpler days. Miss Marple looked out across the darkened green and smiled. It was not a smile of triumph nor even of satisfaction, but of quiet comprehension, the kind of understanding that asked for no reward. The world, she knew, would go on making the same mistakes, and she, in her small way, would go on noticing them. She set down her knitting, poured one last cup of tea, and stirred in a single spoon of sugar. The spoon chimed gently against the porcelain, a small sound almost musical. She lifted the cup, tasted it, and nodded to herself. Just right. And as the clock struck 11, she murmured into the stillness, "There is always another cup to pour, another truth to steep. One must simply wait for it to draw." The candle guttered once, then steadied, casting its calm light over the quiet room. Outside, St. Mildred slept beneath the stars, peaceful again, for now.